very much, everyone, for going ahead and introducing yourself into the chat. My name is Natasha Borges-Sugiyama. I'm the director of CLACS here at UWM. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone in this virtual format and to tell you a little bit about the webinar series and give you a little bit of context for what we're trying to accomplish here. Remarkably, both our campus here at UWM and UW-Madison were planning to host spring 2019, spring 2020 conferences. I have to remember what year I'm in, on the topic of migration. And we both had to postpone due to COVID. And so this was a lament for both of us because we had developed these terrific programs with many wonderful speakers who are going to come in and share their insights with us on various facets of migration and trying to find the silver lining for the need for social distancing. We came to the realization that we could combine our forces, offer what we hope you'll find to be a very vibrant set of panels structured along a webinar series so that weekly we'll cover different facets on this very important topic of migration within within the Americas to the Americas, from Latin America to the US. And so today we have the distinct honor of welcoming you and including three panelists. I'd like to, before I go ahead and introduce the panel, just say a little bit something about the partnership here. I'd like to thank our partners at Madison and the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. Our partner is Kata, Alberto M, who's been helping us with all of our tech and their co-organizers for their series. At UWM, we've been supported not only by Julie Klein, who's here today, but Amy Orendorf, and I'd like to give special recognition to the CLACS faculty fellows who've been helping us in formulating these panels. If you are able, please continue to join us on a weekly basis. I saw that some of you are joining us for the first time, so I thank you for doing so. And I see that others are knee-deep in the series, and so we're excited to see you back. Let me just introduce Rachel Buff, who's doing double duty for us today and talking about her work as well as serving as moderator. I'm sure Rachel will go through some of the logistics of the webinar format. But Rachel is professor of history and the director of community cultures and communities program here at UWM. She served as a CLACS fellow last year, and her most recent book is A for Asylum Seeker. And so I'm pleased to have Rachel introduce the panel and her fellow panelists. Thanks.
Thanks, Natasha. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Em, for all the organizing and supporting and everything. Yeah, I'm Rachel Ida Buff, and I want to say that this is kind of my dream panel. So even though we can't be here presently and go out to dinner and all that stuff, I'm so happy to be here with people whose work I respect so deeply, academic activists. And I think all three of us work at those junctures in interesting ways. So just the mechanics of the panel are going to be that we're going to go in kind of historical order. So, Adam will start us off, and then my stuff is historical, but maybe a little later than his, and Nicole is kind of at the front lines of the contemporary struggle, but she has purchase on historical things because of having to intervene and make legal arguments, which are often historical arguments. So I think what I'll do is just read my introduction for Adam, let him talk, then I'll talk, and then I'll read the introduction for Nicole. Sorry, that's a lot of me, but I am doing double duty here today. So let me just read my introduction for Adam, and then he will speak. You'll hear from him. Sorry, it never fails that I'm doing something my mom calls. It's just, you can set a clock by it. Okay. Adam Goodman is an assistant professor in the Department of History and in the Latin American and Latino Studies program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research and teaching interests include migration history and policy, Mexican American and Latinx history, border and borderlands history, and recent US, Mexican, and Central American history. Goodman's book, The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants, which I just read, it's excellent, traces the troubling history of the US government's systematic efforts to terrorize and expel non-citizens over the past 140 years. The book uncovers public officials' use of force, coercion, and fear to purge immigrants from the country and exert control over those who remain. It introduces the politicians, bureaucrats, business people, and ordinary citizens who have pushed for and profited from expulsion. The Deportation Machine chronicles the devastating human costs of punitive enforcement policies and the innovative strategies people have adopted to fight against removal and redefine belonging in ways that transcend citizenship. Now that's what Adam's bio says. I just want to add that one thing I really love about the book is it's really classic for immigration historians to look at policy and talk about policy, but Adam's really interested in the nitty gritty. Like, so once they said they had to remove you from the country, how did they get you out? And as somebody who reads a lot of this stuff, I'm constantly reading about this law and that law, but what I love about your work is it's really the brass tacks of how it worked and what the consequences of that are on the ground. And I think that's really important for us to know, but I'll let you talk about the rest of it.
Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for that generous introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for making this event possible, and for everyone for signing on and joining us. Can you see the presentation here? No, let me see. I'm just going to try to pull up these slides, which will, nope.
It says you've started screen sharing, but I can't see it. Is that what other people are experiencing?
All right, well, let's see if we can make this work. I'll try.
See it there for a minute.
One more time. Well.
Adam, it was up for just a moment, so.
It was.
I could see it and then it kind of evaporated.
Okay, well, we'll see what we can do.
We're all good. Take your time.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Yeah. There it is.
I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're good. Yay.
We're in business.
Perfect.
Well, thanks for hanging with me there. I apologize for the short delay. But today I'd like to share a little bit of information that comes out of my book project, The Deportation Machine, which is just out within the last couple of months. It's the product of a decade of labor and travels across the United States and Mexico to examine the history of deportation from the United States. And as Rachel mentioned in the introduction, how officials have forced, coerced, and implemented scare and fear campaigns in order to try to push people out of the country. I'm very interested in how the machine works, and I want to be sure to talk about that and explain what I mean by that. I'm also interested in how people have fought back and organized against the machine. I think that's a really key part to the story as well that sometimes is overlooked, although I think that'll be an opportunity for us to engage in a broader discussion today about both past and present efforts of organizing and activism on behalf of immigrants and people facing deportation and those most affected by punitive immigration policies. So the deportation machine, what I mean by that is that there are different mechanisms the United States government has relied on throughout US history, and my book focuses on the last 140 or so years. And what most people don't realize is that deportations from the United States have mostly happened without due process, with little to no due process. I think we might have an idea in our heads, or some people might at least, that a deportation hearing looks like an immigration judge sitting in a courtroom in some kind of formal setting, hearing the merits of a case, taking many factors into consideration and weighing whether or not someone's allowed to stay or not. And what I discovered through my research is that 85 or 90% of all deportations throughout US history have happened through coercive administrative mechanisms, euphemistically referred to as voluntary departures, which you can see here in the top right-hand corner. If you can make it out on the slide, there are three mechanisms I traced throughout 140 years. Formal deportations, voluntary departures, and self-deportations. And these are the three that compose the machine as I define it. And most people have just focused on those formal deportations, which historically have happened, by order of an immigration judge, though as we'll discuss a little later, they've become expedited and streamlined in recent years in troubling ways that have limited people's rights. But you can see in the main graph here that, that solid line represents voluntary departures. And, they represent 48 of the 57 million deportations since the 1880s. And this was a real startling revelation as I crunched a lot of the numbers through my research. I did a lot of statistical quantitative work in the research and also qualitative work, both in the archives as well as interviewing migrants, deportees, and their family members, as well as some people involved in immigration enforcement on the government side. But one of the things that really struck me was that to understand the history of deportation, we need to take these voluntary departures seriously. And a lot of people have not, and I think that's led to some distortions in our understanding of deportation and its importance throughout US history. And in turn, the work gets done to create harmful stereotypes about who is American and who is a quote unquote illegal alien. And so it's paying attention to these mechanisms that really matters. And, voluntary departure, the best way I can describe it is these usually happen after someone is apprehended. It's not as if, there's any kind of choice made by an individual. This happens after an immigration agent apprehends someone and coerces them or pressures them or encourages them to leave the country and to sign a form waiving any chance to fight for the right to stay. And they incentivize this mechanism in particular because they know that the deportation machine has a limited capacity, the Immigration Service has limited budget, and historically, they haven't been able to hold hearings or detain people that they would like to expel from the country. So they have encouraged and pressured them to agree to leave by threatening them with perhaps indefinite stays in detention. Who knows how long your case will take to play out, as well as more punitive consequences. If you fight your case and you're formally deported, you might have a 5, 10, or 20 year, even a lifetime bar on re-entering the country. And so people understand why it makes sense to accept voluntary departure. And what I liken it to in the book is somewhat similar to the role that plea bargains play in the criminal justice system. And if we think of the criminal justice system, how few cases actually make it to trial. In part, that's because prosecutors threaten people with decades in prison to get them to plead to a lesser offense, take a shorter sentence, but they also forego their right to fight their case. And voluntary departures operate in a similar way. So this is something that most historians and journalists, even government officials, haven't necessarily picked up on as much. But for most of the 20th century and into the 21st, this is more or less how 9 out of 10 deportations happened. The third mechanism, which I want to touch on briefly, are the self-deportations. And some of you may remember this. This was a then presidential candidate Mitt Romney's immigration enforcement plan in 2012, which seems like many lifetimes ago now. But he said that he was going to essentially make immigrants' lives so miserable that they would pick up and leave. People who are in the country without authorization. And this has happened historically through a variety of different mechanisms, but in part through fear campaigns. We certainly know in recent years how the government and the Trump administration has ramped these up to, if not previously unknown levels, certainly unprecedented in the recent past. And tried to scare people out of the country, tried to pass laws at the local, state, and also the federal level to make people's lives challenging so they would pick up and leave. And as you see in the bottom right-hand picture, or in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen here, these new newspaper headlines. Another part of this tactic, the self-deportation campaigns, has been to rely on the media to propagate fear and to spread fear, and to try to encourage people to move out of their local community, or in some cases out of the country altogether. So these newspaper headlines are actually not from the recent past, but they're from the 1930s, 1931, during the Great Depression, when there were many repatriation and deportation campaigns. And the headlines are both announcing raids as well as reporting on deportations that have recently occurred. And we see this all the time. And I think it's important for us to understand the work that the media is doing and how, in many cases, government officials, oftentimes unnamed government sources, are pushing things to the media in hopes that they will kind of repeat verbatim or close to it. And that's doing a lot of work that we should be aware of as well. So these are the three mechanisms that compose the deportation machine that I trace. And the voluntary departures and the self-deportations have afforded migrants very little due process, if any, in most cases. Let me see here. In recent years, we can see here in this graph that things have changed, in fact, that formal deportations have become more important. You see formal deportations as a percentage of all expulsions have increased in recent years. And in fact, after 2011, they outnumbered voluntary departures for the first time in 75 years. This has a lot to do with some changes to immigration law in the 1990s, especially the 1996 Immigration Act, which expanded the categories that could be, or that could result in one's deportation, and the type of people who could be deported, including permanent residents. And this has been a marked change, I think a real important change. In many ways, my book traces a story of continuity, of the deportation machine targeting people for very explicit reasons, sometimes as a result of the bureaucratic interests, sometimes capitalist interests and imperatives have driven it, and also certainly racism that's exercised in the individual level, but also baked into the system. But one of the big changes we see in the recent past is this shift toward formal deportations. And in part, that's because formal deportations have come to resemble voluntary departures in a lot of ways. They have become streamlined as never before. And this graph, and I'll just discuss it very briefly, there's a lot going on here, but essentially, this breaks down formal deportations by the type of removal, and it shows that expedited removals and reinstatement of removals, which are both streamlined, fast-track deportation processes that provide immigrants very little, if any, due process or legal rights, these have increased dramatically, not just in the Trump administration, but starting in the Bill Clinton administration, who has played an important role in ramping up immigration enforcement, we could say. This has been entirely, as I found in the research, largely a bipartisan effort. Right? Democrats and Republicans alike have done a lot to build the deportation machine as we know it. We could perhaps see that change moving forward. I'm holding my breath on that one, but it's something that both parties have helped to construct and build. And we see that since the late 1990s, more than half of all formal deportations have happened through these expedited means. And in the last years of the Obama administration, it was more than 80% of formal deportations happened through these expedited means. And I think this is a shocking kind of statistic to wrap our head around, but to realize that so much of what seems outrageous that we hear about in the news today, actually there's a fair amount of continuity with previous administrations as well. And that was something, as I uncovered in the research, I started to wrestle with those questions and thinking about what kind of nation is the United States. That's the question that begins my book, in part because as I crunched the numbers and realized there's been 57 million deportations in the last 140 years. That's more than any other country in the world. And also in the last century, there have been more deportations from the United States than there have been people allowed to stay here on a permanent basis. Right? More expulsions than people granted permanent residency. And that raised this larger question of what kind of nation is the United States? A nation of immigrants, a nation that's welcomed immigrants throughout its history, a nation that's been discriminating against certain people for certain reasons, and who's been targeted has changed over time. But one thing we do know is that Mexicans represent 85 to 90% also of all deportees throughout U.S. history. And that disproportionate targeting of a single group of people has gone a long way, I think, to creating these harmful stereotypes of Latinos as prototypical illegal aliens. We've certainly seen in recent years Central American asylum seekers who have come to occupy that place as well. And the book starts in the late 19th century with the targeting of Chinese labor migrants and some Southern and Eastern European migrants. But one thing I do want to close my comments on here, and I'm very much looking to our discussion after, is that as long as the deportation machine has existed, people have been trying to figure out and understand how it works and trying to identify its weak points and then press on them, apply pressure to them. And they've been successful. I mean, the story of resistance is important here as well. The story of activism is really important. And, you know, actually, Rachel's book, Against the Deportation Terror, which I highly recommend if you have not read yet, an extraordinary account of a little known organization called the American Committee for Protection of Foreign-Born that fought and organized, you know, broad-based, multiracial, multicultural struggle on behalf, you know, of all people. And, you know, these struggles are cumulative. They built on one another over time. And in this picture here, you see a group in Chicago who are literally putting their physical bodies and well-being on the line to block a deportation bus, sitting in front of it and wrapping their arms around one of, you know, the wheels on this side. There's another group on the other side, you know, to stop this bus from transporting people, you know, to Chicago's O'Hare Airport for expulsion flights, you know, that would be taking place. And they succeeded in this case. You know, where the weak points are has changed over time. But people have been consistently pushing back against the machine and trying to fight on behalf of migrants and to ensure that they do have rights before the law, basic human rights, basic civil rights that I think, you know, most people would imagine and argue that anyone in the country should have, regardless of their legal status. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Adam. That was both gigantic and really admirably succinct, which is not easy to be both. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen now. Okay, can folks see that?
Yes.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that just got published this summer, A is for Asylum Seeker, which came out of the crisis, which again seems like ancient history, but that is still going on, of caravan seekers arriving, caravans of asylum seekers and refugees and migrants arriving at the US-Mexico border in 2018, 2019. Now, of course, this is an older and ongoing crisis, but my encounter with it was in Tijuana, part of the time working with Otro, Lado, and Nicole, which is Nicole's organization, and a couple of other organizations there. I also want to say that, thank you for the shout out, Adam, about Against the Deportation Terror. So I've been working with Voces de la Frontera, which is an immigrant rights movement here in Milwaukee, since I moved here in 2004. And as a historian, I really wanted to know what the precedent was for the extraordinary fluorescence of immigrant rights organizing that we've been witnessing here, thanks to our representative, Jim Sensenbrenner, now retiring, who really launched the immigrant rights movement by trying to criminalize immigrant rights advocacy and solidarity back in 2006. So thank you, Representative Sensenbrenner. That is the only time I will ever say that. So I really want to know, has this happened before? You know, marching down the street with, 30,000 other people and thinking, where does this come from? And I dug around, as historians tend to do, and I found that there was this kind of beautiful, suppressed, multiracial history of immigrant rights advocacy starting in the 1930s and really lasting up until that really there's a steady stream of immigrant rights advocacy that started then and continues now, and that it was multi-ethnic and multiracial, because usually it was around communities that were aggrieved by what they referred to as the deportation terror. So my book traces the history of the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born, which was a Popular Front organization, meaning that it was loosely affiliated with other left-leaning and communist organizations in the 1930s through the actually the American Committee lasted through the 1980s, so they got really red-baited during McCarthyism, and they attempted to drive the American Committee out of existence. And my argument really is that they survived the repression of the Cold War because foreign-born communities needed them to. There was no other alternative. So other organizations kind of closed their doors in this period, but the American Committee persisted into the 1980s, at which point there was such an extraordinary fluorescence around Haitian refugee rights, around Central American refugee rights, around Latino, Latinx, you know, that the American Committee kind of melds into that. So I really wrote this book as a love letter to contemporary immigrant rights organizing, but I learned a little something about love letters, which is if you write a love letter, you have to write it to the people that you're talking to. And you know, the thing about academic history is it's really important to have these stories. Like, I really think that the reason that most people don't know the story of the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born is just straight up and ongoing red baiting. You know, that not only were they trying to extinguish the organizations, they were trying to extinguish their memories. So I think of this as a really important work of restoration, but it's written as academic history, and I think it's not very accessible. So I wanted to do something different because I was really conscious when I was writing my next book, which I wrote in 2019, that the crisis around the caravans was a politically manufactured crisis that was about manipulating language. So I wanted to write a guide to how we can reclaim our language from being demeaned by people who are trying to make very basic acts of human solidarity into criminal acts. So As for Asylum Seeker is a different kind of book. It's an academic adjacent book. It's a bilingual book. It appears in facing page English-Spanish translation. And it's a little bit of a different approach to writing the same love letter that my first book, the other book, was about. So I'm going to read you the entry. C is for caravan. There are 31 words in this book, not every one for every letter, obviously, but it's in alphabetical order. It's written as an epistolary. So I'm going to read you the entry about C is for caravan, and then in English, and then I'll talk a little more about that. So this is a story, is a story from my first trip to do solidarity work in Tijuana in January 2019. We drive south towards the border, our car packed with so many trash bags full of donated clothes, diapers, and household goods that the two of us in the back seat perch on top of them. The supervisor at Border Angels, a San Diego trans-border human rights organization in operation since 1986, assembled our caravan of volunteers in cars this morning and directed us to go through customs and head to El Baratal, a former nightclub now repurposed as a camp for thousands of people who have arrived in Tijuana and now await their turn to cross the border. Then he hopped into his van and we peeled out, heading south down I-5. Nervous, we quickly lose sight of that van and the other cars, forget all about customs, blow across the border, and arrive at the camp 2 hours ahead of the rest of our caravan. Through text, the supervisor connects us with one of the caravan leaders, Felipe, who meets us outside the heavily policed gates of El Baratal. We park and Felipe looks into our car, organizing our cargo into neat piles on the seats and in the trunk. People drift out of the camp, chatting with us and asking if we have things they need, like children's shoes and warmer clothing, because it's chilly in Tijuana in January, particularly if you were sleeping outside. They tell us about their caravan experiences, the long overland walk, a parrot that made the trip on someone's shoulder, families left at home waiting for word about when it might be safe to come north and join them. A Haitian man tells me about his sea voyage to Brazil and his long journey from there up through Latin America to the US border. Why didn't you stay in one of those other places? I ask him. He smiles. Because I want to feel safe somewhere, he says. Together we wait for the rest of our caravan for over 2 hours. I'm struck by the grace and discipline of these pedestrian caravan members. Although they clearly need and want what we are bringing them, no one except Felipe moves past where we are standing to look into the car. The four of us driving the car this morning are unused to the protocols of safe caravan conduct. We lose track of the other cars, forget our instructions, get lost in sprawling Tijuana. But sticking together and following the rules is essential for collective survival, which is the origin and purpose of caravans. There's safety in numbers. It's safer to sleep outside at night if people take turns watching. Easier to cross rivers if someone is standing on the riverbank, reaching for your hand. Caravans are strategies for collective survival. Historically, caravans have often been associated with Roma people, South Asian origin people on the move who travel through Europe. Often persecuted because of suspicions that their traveling lifestyle relied on theft, Roma were categorized by Nazis as racially unfit. Many died in concentration camps during World War II. Forced to leave their homelands because of repression or violence, caravans of people on the move create solidarity and safety as they travel together. Since 2017, a series of caravans organized by organizations like Pueblos Sin Fronteras have gathered on the border of Mexico and Guatemala and walked to the US-Mexico border. Pueblos Sin Fronteras states its purpose to accompany migrants and refugees in their journey of hope and together demand our human rights. Through their collective migration and presence at the border, these caravan participants defy distinctions between migrants and refugees. Despite the claims of the caravans to internationally established rights, the US Department of Homeland Security treats the caravans as aggressive invasions by criminal aliens, claiming that people on the move bring with them the violence and repression they flee, as if they were a contagious social disease instead of historically created conditions. Mexican migrant advocate Irma Garrido describes the communal rights perspective of contemporary caravans as a revolutionary strategy by which people on the move protect themselves and assert their right to survive and thrive. With their beautiful human acts of solidarity, perhaps the caravans can show us all how to inhabit our beleaguered planet. And in other versions of this talk, well, I'll give this version and then we can talk about that. So this talk is called Thinking Like a Caravan, and I wanted to flip things around a little because the caravans were an occasion to demonize refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers, and to conflate those fairly precisely legally and historically defined categories. And I think that the reason that that was successful is because of a long-term historical demonization of collectivity. And this runs right through my last book, where the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born are demonized as communists because they're working in solidarity and often out of communities of the foreign-born. And I think that in this country, we've had a forcible unlearning and a forcible forgetting of historical acts of collectivity. And in fact, at this point, we have unlearned those to the point where it's literally killing us. So if you think about the act of wearing a mask, which is fairly contentious here in Milwaukee, there is a masking order in Milwaukee. The governor has made and repealed masking orders. If you leave Milwaukee and go to the very red collar counties, nobody wears a mask. And it's so interesting to me because it's a very low ask. You know, I'm wearing a mask because I don't want to get you sick, and I want you to wear a mask so you don't get me sick. It's an act of collective care, but it's very contentious in, I think, the same ways that the caravans were, that these acts of collectivity are somehow incendiary. And a quote from a really excellent interview with Wendy Brown in the lovely little magazine Drift, which is fairly new. The idea that social distancing is actually a collective social pact, a worldwide mutual pact, not about any individual, but necessary to contain the spread of the virus, is incomprehensible from a perspective in which there are only individuals. Now, the caravans are performing similar acts of collective mutual aid, right? So you can make a decision. And in the slide, let us be cognizant that the waters globally are rising, right? So this is a slide of caravan seekers crossing a river, helping each other out. Because as you can see, with the water being this high, you probably want to be holding somebody's hand. We have some collective decisions to make about if we are going to help one another out to survive or not. I think part of the demonization of these caravans was defying the idea that we do better together. So I'm going to rocket through a little bit of the historicizing these caravans, which are Central American, but as you could glean from the short piece I read you, also very international. There are people from Haiti and Africa and the Caribbean and Russia and Europe in the caravan. So it's fairly easy to get a travel visa to Brazil and Ecuador, and many of the Africans and Caribbeans, some of the Russians who enter this way and then walk and join with other folks walking all this way. And these are, I think, extraordinary historical acts about fleeing intolerable conditions of repression that are also historically created. So why do people have to leave? And I always like to quote the Somali British poet Warsan Shire, who says, "You don't put your child in a leaky boat unless the water is safer than the land," right? So I don't think anyone takes the decision to flee lightly. This is a print of early conflict, a very early conflict between Anglo-British colonists in New England and Algonquian Indians there in the Pequot Wars, where at the end of the Pequot Wars, it was said that no Pequots could ever see their name again. You could not use that word. This has a funny coda, which has to do with the Indian Gaming Act. And those folks were either sold into slavery or displaced to the very margins of New England society. They were not supposed to be, literally. They were not supposed to exist anymore. Many had been killed, but many still existed. And I think we have to see this as an ongoing process. In the case of the murder of indigenous Lenca activist Berta Cáceres in 2014, her advocacy was for maintaining her people's lands and connection to their particular river. And one of the most dangerous activities in this hemisphere is to be an environmental activist or a journalist covering environmental activism, because there are transnational business interests that want to develop the water, that want the minerals, that continuously. So if you think about this as really a 500-year struggle, like week to week, it wasn't like there was the Pequot War and then suddenly there's struggles over indigenous land in Honduras. This process of displacement, making indigenous people into itinerants, is continuous. We could go back to, and I don't have time to go into it very much now, but we could also go back to the Fugitive Slave Acts of the, one of the very first laws in 1793 under George Washington is a Fugitive Slave Act. In other words, if there's a stray African-American person in the Republic, the suspicion that they're fugitive slaves gets to prevail, and the slave catchers have more rights than possible escaped slaves or freeborn African and African-American peoples. The refugee regime we inhabit now, where some people are thought of as refugees and others are thought of as migrants, and this is another linguistic move to attend. So refugees since 1945, when the United Nations paid attention to the displaced persons crisis in Europe by saying, people who are displaced should have rights. In the 1951 High Convention on Refugee Rights, they were elevating a certain kind of migrant as having special rights. And this tends to be concurrent globally with the denigration of the rights of migrants. So refugees in, migrants out. It's funny, this is one of many things in my career that I used to disparage, but now, as the category of refugee collapses beneath us, I'm saying, well, maybe we should keep at least some people having these rights. And that happens in many places. There's the refugee crisis in Hong Kong around the same period that is eventually recognized by the United Nations, which is initially focused mostly on European refugees. The United States really has a reckoning with the refugee crisis of 1975 after we leave North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And the Refugee Act of 1980 passes right as the dirty wars in Central America are leading to more and more refugees coming from El Salvador and Honduras, from the Northern Triangle of Central America, Guatemala, and the Haitian refugee crisis precipitated by the Duvaliers, who are strong allies of the United States. They're people we prop up, but who are fairly vicious dictators. And this precipitates a crisis, and I think this is the last thing I'm going to say because I'm about to be out of time, but there's a very interesting coinciding between the Refugee Act of 1980, which is one of the late acts of the Carter administration, passing and saying, we're going to have a certain amount of refugees every year. We have international humanitarian obligations, and the start of the indefinite detention of asylum seekers, which is a Reagan administration end run around the Refugee Act of 1980, which is to say, the Reagan administration is witnessing the wellspring of Central American and Haitians, these Latinx and Afro-diasporic folks arriving in the United States and saying, we don't want these people here. How can we halt this while still on paper observing the Refugee Act of 1980? And what they come up with is first interdiction. We're going to scoop people up at sea before they get here and dump them back, Haitians back in Port-au-Prince, regardless of what they're saying, because if they haven't made it to shore yet, we don't have to treat them as refugees. They're just people who are lost at sea. And then those who come here and make it to land, so you put one foot in and you can claim asylum, right? Those who come here, we're going to detain them indefinitely. And this is really important because it's the kind of seeds of our current detention crisis. So when the UN starts talking about refugees in 1951 and then about asylum seekers and their rights in 1967, it doesn't say anywhere that to claim asylum, you might face indefinite detention. It says that this should be a protected category. And I always like to tell people to think about the popular Hulu series, The Handmaid's Tale, in which the proposition is that, the United States has been taken over. Imagine this, the United States has been taken over by right-wing fascists, but you can escape to Canada and the Canadians will welcome you with open arms and give you resources. And this is a fantasy, this notion that you can, that there's a country that is welcoming and well-resourced and open to people fleeing oppression. Okay, yeah, I think I'm gonna stop there because I think I've used up my time. Thanks so much. And then I'm gonna put on my other hat and introduce Nicole. Okay, so Nicole Ramos directs the Border Rights Project of Otro, Lado. The project works with asylum seekers in Tijuana, Mexico, who want to present themselves to US authorities. In addition to providing direct services to asylum seekers and their families, the project engages in broader legislative, media, and legal advocacy efforts to challenge systemic human rights violations committed by state actors. Nicole also provides on-the-ground technical assistance, country conditions research, and expert declarations to US attorneys with case needs in Mexico. Prior to joining Otro, Lado, Nicole worked for 6 years as an assistant federal public defender in Montgomery, Alabama, where she represented clients charged with federal felony offenses and death row inmates challenging their convictions and death sentences in federal habeas proceedings. She is a graduate of Bryn Mawr College and Temple University James E. Beasley School of Law. So that's her official bio, but I just want to add, and also a force of light. And just having been at Otro, Lado for a little while, I'm amazed by just the beautiful, powerful refuge that Nicole and her associates create there. So I'm so happy that you're here with us.
Thank you so much. That was quite an introduction. Hopefully I live up to that. So Adam and Rachel have done a really good job of talking about how US immigration policy has been weaponized in order to exclude all different kinds of immigrants. And the focus of my work at the border is looking at how those policies seek to limit access to the asylum process and exclude large classes of asylum seekers, largely from Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and countries that are not white. Because as has become evident to many of us over the last few years, our agency, DHS, and our government has been infiltrated by white nationalists. The policies that they're coming out with are used to deter very specific populations. And our project at Border Rights Project, we do two things. We do legal orientation and know your rights training with individual asylum seekers and families. And that's where we're letting them know what could be the possible impact of the policies as they stand today on their individual case, as they move through the system, through the court system, possibly through the detention system. And then the other piece of our work is human rights monitoring. And that occurs in a number of different forms. That occurs most physically in the immediate at the port of entry, where we have volunteers and staff that are monitoring what Mexican officials are doing at the port of entry and what US officials are doing and the kinds of stories that migrants are relating. But human rights monitoring also occurs more subtly in the context of our individual consultations with asylum seekers, or when they reach out to us after they've had an encounter with an official to discuss why that encounter was problematic. In the last 6 years, we've seen a number of different policies roll out. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's just not enough time to talk about the horror that we've been able to churn out in the last 6 years. But two really important policies that have had a really outsized impact is the policy of metering, which is known as the wait list. And that's where we force asylum seekers to go put their name on a list at the port of entry in Mexico. That list is actually operated by Mexican officials. So we've essentially designated part of our processing to refugees to a foreign government that has its own serious history of human rights abuses. And it forces asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for months and months on end. The last time that the list was open in March, the wait list estimated time was around 8 to 9 months. And that's a huge amount of time to ask someone to wait at a border when they're a migrant, because they're outside of their home communities. They are more noticeable because they are not part of the local community. And more importantly, they're not around their family and their community members. And so if something happens to them, no one knows what's happened to them. So they're very easily to exploit, which make them a popular target for law enforcement, for extortion, and organized crime. The second policy is not metering, it's the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as MPP. We refer to it in the field as the Migrant Persecution Protocols because that feels a little bit more apt for what is happening. And it's also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. And that's where we process asylum seekers, and some of them may have been on the wait list, they may have been metered, they may have waited for 6 to 9 months before they got to the front of the line and said, I'm here to seek asylum, I'm ready to be processed. And we decide, no, you are from X country and therefore you must go wait in Mexico. And we will give you a date in the future to appear at court in San Diego, but in the interim, you're going to have to go back to that shelter or to that refugee camp. Depending on what part of the border you're at, the waiting looks different. In Matamoros, there's a really large tent encampment where people are just subject to all of the elements. In Tijuana, we have more of a shelter system, and then people who are not in the shelters are eventually moving out and renting rooms and getting by that way. And much like metering, the MPP policy puts people at a great vulnerability for being trafficked, for being extorted, for being kidnapped or disappeared, sexually assaulted. And we've had those range of consequences happen to all of our clients. And the government, the US government, will publicly state the reason why we're putting these policies in place is to protect the migrants. It's to cut down on human trafficking. It's to make it so people show up to court. It's so that everyone has access to justice. But there's a difference between what they say and what's reality. I mean, I could tell everyone from 9 a.m. to sundown that I'm Oprah Winfrey, but obviously I'm not Oprah Winfrey, I'm Nicole Ramos. And just because I say this is to protect someone, the actual impact is not protection, because organized crime and Mexican law enforcement understand that everyone is stuck here and it's just, sitting ducks. Now, part of what we do is individual, right? We're doing this legal accompaniment, and we're preparing the individual to understand how the system is going to apply to them and what are their rights, but most importantly, how are state actors going to likely try to violate those rights, and what could their responses be? What could the talismanic words be to prevent that family separation from happening, to prevent them from being coerced to sign a document that orders their removal, to prevent themselves from giving a statement such as they don't have a fear of returning to their home country. And more so than that, it also creates these individuals, informants and reporters out of each individual, because each individual will go and interact with the system and get into spaces that lawyers will never have access to. I will never be allowed into the holding area in the port of entry. I will never be allowed into the ICE van or into the ICE detention center. but the asylum seekers that we work with will. And when they feel like there are people, attorneys, activists, organizers accompanying them in this process that they trust, they're going to share this very critical information that's going to show us where are the breaks in the system, where is the government trying to squeeze out access. Now, these policies, particularly metering and MPP, could not occur without the complicity and the collaboration of the Mexican government, which is interesting because these policies do put an incredible strain on Mexico, on the local economy, on the local social services system. And the metering policy specifically impacts Mexican asylum seekers. Mexican asylum seekers are still subject to this wait list. And essentially you have a Mexican asylum seeker being forced to put their name on a wait list with a Mexican official and saying, please, can I have my turn to escape this country, sir? And it doesn't matter if the people that they are fearing persecution are Mexican officials. It's not always organized crime that causes people to leave. And so we're really putting Mexican asylum seekers in quite a position. And the Mexican government has made very clear decisions that it trade with the US and not raising the ire of President Trump is more important at this point in time than the rights of their own citizens. Now, a lot of the rights or the conservatives would say, well, there's just not enough room to process people, right? We need to have this orderly system. We can't hear all the cases at once. We can't let all the people in at once. There's just not enough room. In the context of our human rights monitoring and our work with clients, what we do is the way that the government weaponizes the policies against the migrant community, we weaponize migrants' stories against the government. And we take their individual stories and we look for trends and we aggregate them. And we bring the evidence of these trends into federal court and we file impact litigation challenging these policies and these practices by authorities. In that way, our advocacy strategy is very much informed by what is impacting the community. It's a very it's a solidarity way of approaching litigation as opposed to coming in as an NGO and making decisions about what the community needs. And when you have that kind of buy-in and when the community feels as if we all own this lawsuit, you are going to get much further. You're going to get more rich detail. And aggregating all of these individual horror stories and putting it in nice clean data sets is so important because federal court judges don't care about human rights. Federal court judges, if they can avoid a constitutional question or interpreting a statute, they're going to avoid it. They want things that are cold and quantifiable. And a lot of people, when they think about Brown versus the Board of Education, they forget that in order to get that decision, that was years and years of empirical research. That was years of pulling data. And that's very much what we're trying to do with our individual work, but then our human rights monitoring work, which propels our advocacy strategy. And the important part about a advocacy strategy that's reactive is the federal government is trying to exhaust us. And when you are constantly in a defensive position such as us, you can't have enough staff. I mean, I could have 100 staff and still be fighting this problem like we are in a UFC cage match. And so what we do is we rely a lot on volunteers. And this has not changed during the pandemic. We have hundreds of volunteers that support our work every week, from high school students to people who they're getting their PhD or they already have their PhD and they're really accomplished individuals. And we're really focused on taking the skills of each individual and figuring out what can they contribute to this movement for immigrant rights. So it's something that we all feel deeply invested in and it's something that we all own. And it really is a move of solidarity. And as I was mentioning earlier, conservatives, they do feel that there's not enough room, we can't process everyone at once, this is the orderly way to do it. But what they are forgetting is we are receiving the victims of our own foreign policy. If you look at a lot of the places where we're seeing the highest levels of migration, you can see the handprint of US intervention, most notably through the School of the Americas, which is located in Columbus, Georgia at Fort Benning. That is a school where we have taught many Latin American police officers, military members, government officials, people who would go on to become paramilitaries or guerrilla forces, how to stamp out popular movements, how to torture people, how to move the winds of capitalism. And through the School of the Americas and our foreign policy in Latin America, we've essentially supported friendly dictators and puppet democracies. We have had a hand in the 36-year-old civil war in Guatemala, and we today still have thousands and thousands of indigenous Guatemalans that are coming forward to our border. We supported the 2009 coup in Honduras. Honduras is another country where we see a lot of migration from. I don't know if some of you remember or know Archbishop Oscar Romero. He was a famous religious figure in El Salvador. He was assassinated, and some of those involved in his assassination did attend the School of the Americas. Not too many years ago, he was canonized and made a saint by the Catholic Church. And so just let this sit for a moment. Our tax dollars killed a saint, right? So we are receiving the victims of our own foreign policy in that regard. And then our own domestic policy has destabilized these countries as well, because we exported our own homegrown gang crisis of MS-13 and 18th Street, which were gangs that grew up in Los Angeles, to Central America in the 1990s up until present day, to countries that we had destabilized and were ill-equipped to receive these folks and integrate them into society. And so the confluence of problems that people are fleeing are ones that we very much created. And now at this point, we're saying, no, you can't come in. And so our position as an organization is that we are morally responsible for accepting these people. And we as an organization are responsible for training them how to engage with a system that is not designed to protect them, that we must disabuse people of this notion, and that we arm them with information of how the law works on the books and how it works in practice. So that way they can be prepared to engage in this psychological warfare. Because there's a true difference to how someone will process through the system when they understand that the hand that they think is there to protect them is really just there to push them out. And I can't tell you how many calls I've had with asylum seekers that have passed through the system, they've gotten through detention, and they've said, you know, you all told us what would happen, and it happened just as you explained. And the reason why we're able to give them this information of all the tricks that are up the government's sleeve is because asylum seekers that trusted us at the outset have come back and reported to us what is happening. And so that way our information can always be accurate and up to date. And they themselves are guiding the curriculum for our program. And they themselves are involved in protecting those who are to come behind them. Now, I don't have much longer, but I do want to just leave you with a story of how this work has just impacted one person and how they move through our program. And I'm going to change her name, but we worked with this woman in her 70s. Her name is Mayra. She is a political activist and a grandmother from Venezuela. When I first met her at the port of entry one morning, I was giving a tour to some new employees of the Mexican embassy that had come from Mexico City to see the port of entry in Tijuana. And I was sort of explaining who all the actors were and how this works. And Mayra stumbled up and she was very clearly disoriented, and she wanted to know who we were, and she was basically looking for help. She had just been sent back to Mexico under MPP after waiting for many, many months. She had been in custody at the border in the hieleras, which are the ice boxes, for several days. She had gotten violently ill from the rotten food that they feed people there, and she was just in really bad, desperate shape. And so the first thing we did was we had a volunteer accompany her to the health clinic that we collaborate with, Refugee Health Alliance, to make sure that she was physically okay. And once we got that medical clearance, then we set her up for legal orientation and a consult. And once we understood more about her case, we then moved on to help her complete her asylum application. We helped her to translate her evidence, all the different reports and documents that she had brought with her from Venezuela. We helped her access a pro bono forensic evaluation to give context to the injuries that she had suffered when she was jailed for her political beliefs in Venezuela. And we did trial preparation with her, where we did practice cross-examination so she could understand truly what that adversarial environment would look like. And I can't tell you for my staff and for myself, the impact of getting a call from this woman in San Diego at the end of that day of her hearing saying, I'm free, I won. And there's no other feeling. This work takes such an incredible emotional toll, but to get that kind of feedback from someone and know that this person, this migrant, who we all are guilty in some respects of infantilizing migrants and not recognizing their agency, was given the tools and they stood up to the most powerful government on earth and they won. And so that is the true impact, I think, of this project, which is based so much on solidarity across borders, across volunteers, and this pact that we make with the migrant community. And I think that's my time. Thank you so much for having me here this afternoon, and I look forward to all of your questions.
Thanks so much for that, Nicole. This was really great. The conversation so far, the presentations. Thank you both. I guess I want to open this up for questions, so folks can type their questions into the chat. We're happy to read them. And while people are sort of cogitating, I was really appreciative, Nicole, of your kind of the way the last third of your talk engaged the international piece of this, because so often when I speak to American audiences, non-foreign born audiences, that how can we have room for them question comes up. And, you know, the immediate answer is, well, maybe just stop making their countries awful. And then there would be room for them to exert what's being called more and more in Latin America, the right to stay home. So I think when we think internationally, it seems less like, well, we can't, you know, my students, we can't take everyone, right? So I wanted to ask Adam and Nicole, maybe you want to add something to this too, if we could expand our conversation a little and think more internationally. I've just finished Roberto Lovato's amazing book, Unforgetting, which is a generational story of his Salvadoran family and what he calls, you know, migration, war, and revolution in the Americas. So I know that that's within the ways both of you think, and I wonder if we could think internationally a little bit here.
I mean, I think that, you know, I would take up, I guess, the question of, you know, what could be done. I mean, there are ways in which the current system as is could be reformed that would make an incredible difference in the lives of migrants, asylum seekers, permanent residents, citizens, everyone. You know, it wouldn't fix all the problems, but you know, there are measures that U.S. Congress, you know, could take, that the executive branch could take to reform the system, and that would be, I think, incredibly important, you know, to pursue. I know there's some people that are pushing for broader changes, you know, revolutionary transformations of the immigration system, and I think, you know, that should be on the table as well. I mean, what we clearly know, and this came up in both of your presentations, which I found really compelling. You know, it's the state policies, which is something I examine in my work as well. It's the state policies that are creating these categories of illegality and the marginalization and the violence against migrants. You know, we don't have to normalize, you know, things as they are or take them for granted. And they can change, right? Different policies, a different set of policies would lead to different outcomes in a more humane immigration and asylum system. And that has something to do with, you know, the elections and, you know, who's in control. But at the same time, you know, recognizing both the United States' historic labor demands and need for migrants, just taking that as a given, you know, that has been historically the case, as well as the many family connections. And as you both mentioned, you know, the fact that the United States intervention abroad has also generated many, you know, migrant and refugee streams to the United States in turn, right? And the saying of, you know, we're here because you were there, right? I mean, which applies to many groups. But you know, if we accept migration as a given, we know people are going to continue migrating for any number of reasons, right? And adjusted policies to account for that reality, you know, while also taking into consideration, you know, the needs of the nation, et cetera, you know, we could find, I think, a more humane system. I'm not saying that would be easy, but, you know, it's the policies, you know, that have created so many of these harmful outcomes, you know, for citizens, non-citizens alike, and they could be different.
Rachel, this is Julie. You'll note there's also a couple questions in the Q&A tab.
And I forgot to unmute myself. Okay, here we go. Alberto Vargas says, thank you for these excellent presentations. Are there ongoing efforts to bring some of the cases detailed in the presentations to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights or to the International Court of Justice in The Hague? Would this be worth pursuing?
I can speak to that. Well, the United States government they don't subscribe to the authority to anyone. They might send someone to sit in the chair and listen politely during a hearing, although during the Trump administration, we've had several hearings before the Inter-American Commission in which the government sent no one, and we made our argument to an empty chair where opposing counsel would otherwise sit. But that doesn't mean that we don't use regional or international human rights tribunals to have other kinds of conversations in order to push the needle, because it's not so much to get the US to do something, but it's to force the rest of the world to have this conversation that must be had about US power and how US power of exclusion impacts citizens from all over the world. And these governments are of countries where we're receiving the highest populations, they at some point have to ask themselves, is what I get from the US worth more than the lives of my own citizens? And when they make the decision that yes, it is worth more than the lives of our own citizens, that's how popular movements are spawned. And particularly now, when you have under the Trump administration this intensified collaboration between Mexico and the US, and between the US and Central America, that collaboration has always existed, but it's just intensified under this administration. A lot of these policies can't happen without the collusion of these governments. And these governments do submit to the authority of international and regional human rights tribunals. And so while we are bringing litigation in federal court against the US government, we have the opportunity to meet these other governments in the forum that they recognize. And that's something that we are actively pursuing as an organization in the last year. We've filed several requests, both just as ourselves as an organization in conjunction with coalitions of organizations requesting hearings against Mexico, as well as the US, but largely against Mexico before the Inter-American Commission.
Thanks, Nicole. Adam, did you want to respond to that question? Okay, I'm going to go on to the next one. Lucy Polo asks, is there some weak spot in the deportation machine that is possible to visualize to stop this? That's a really great question. Do either of you want to speak to that? Weak spot in the deportation machine? It's your phrase, Adam, so.
Well, I would just say, and I'm actually curious to hear what both of you have to say about this question. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, the weak spots are shifting over time. They don't remain constant. So in my work, I traced the case of, a group of shoe factory workers in the late 1970s who did many of the same things that Nicole just mentioned in terms of working with migrants, who are at the center of these struggles, running Know Your Rights workshops, running public relations media campaigns, prepping people for cross-examination in the courtroom, and all that really paid off. And in the case that I traced, dozens of people ended up, winning and having their deportation orders canceled, stayed. The government couldn't, prove their unauthorized status in the country. But that was at a time before databases were integrated and everyone's personal information was available with a couple of clicks of your mouse. And things change over time. So I'm curious actually to hear, Nicole, if you think your work at El Otro Lado has, even in the last few years, changed, or if you found different strategies that you're relying on or things that no longer work. I know that here in Chicago, many activists obviously have been organizing, perhaps more than ever, but also trying to find new strategies and tactics that under the Obama administration worked, but under the Trump administration, have not been as effective. So I'd be curious to hear from each of you if you feel like you've noticed things with the networks and colleagues you're in dialogue with.
Nicole, do you want to respond?
Certainly. Yeah, the strategies are always evolving because the government is always adapting to our strategies. You know, previously we would present asylum seekers at the port of entry. That was how my work in this got started, and just refusing to move. And sometimes that would be a few minutes, sometimes that would be a few hours, sometimes that would be a few days. But that's no longer a strategy that works because of the increased militarization of the border and the complete willingness of both the US and Mexican government to use soldiers against migrants and human rights defenders. So that has to change. And so I think maybe a strategy that we've adopted since then is trying to work through the regional and international human rights mechanisms and having these conversations that are not so much directed at the US, but directed at the governments and the people of the countries where we're seeing so much forced migration, and trying to see if we can get accountability somewhere, right? But I don't know that there is a weak spot. I am of the opinion that we need to burn it all down. That is actually the mantra of our organization: burn it all down. We don't want jobs. We want a system that looks nothing like this, because it is premised upon the idea of deportation and not on freedom. And that's inconsistent with American values. And it shouldn't be applied in this way, because the race or the color of the skin of the immigrants that we're receiving isn't in line with our white nationalism.
Yeah, thank you both. I really like the question, because I think the deportation machine is both terrifying and vulnerable, right? So it really depends how we talk about it. Like, you know, there's sort of a popular idiom that President Obama gave us DACA, and now Trump is going to take it away. Well, that's not really how it happened. You had young, undocumented activists coming out as undocumented, taking extraordinary risks to protest publicly, getting themselves apprehended and interned in detention centers so they could figure out what was going on. That's what brought us DACA. Right, and DACA was a compromise between their vision, closer to Nicole's, of burn it all down, and it kind of winds up being this midway thing, which now is endangered under this crazy regime. But the deportation machine is always changing and always has vulnerabilities. I mean, I see it in the American Committee people in the 50s. Like, they got people off deportation by saying, well, yes, he's a communist, but it's just philosophical, which I just sat in the archives and laughed. Like, I didn't know that could get you off. Like, he just likes to read about communism. He wasn't going to do anything. So, like, I think it's everything all the time. And I think we see that now in this really horrible time where everything is under siege. Like, one thing that's happened on our not sanctuary campus, despite lots of efforts, is I think that different student groups, like the students that have been advocating for sanctuary campus around immigration stuff, have become networked with some of the LGBTQ trans students who are fighting their struggles, because sanctuary is not just about being detained and deported by ICE. It's broader because the threats are so huge. So as horrible as the time we're inhabiting is, it creates different kinds of coalitions and makes different kinds of action possible. Not to be the glass half full person in this crew, but I think the deportation machine is always, like, we should always be like tapping at it and figuring out where its vulnerabilities are, right? Okay, anonymous attendee. Many people who become aware of the situations that you describe want to know what they can do as individuals. What do you recommend?
That's my favorite question. No, I didn't pay that person to ask that. But so what can you do? There's lots of things that you can do, and it's just depending on what community you want to focus on. Do you want to focus on your local community? And if so, there's accompaniment directories that are produced by the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee that will list all the immigrant rights or immigrant accompaniment organizations by state. So maybe that's offering to show a new asylum-seeking family that's arrived how to register their kids in school, or how to access the food pantry, or how to learn how to drive. There's lots of ways that immigrants could get some support in integrating into the community and feeling like they belong. And when people feel like they belong and they're integrated, then they're going to be able to become economically self-sufficient. And with self-sufficient comes hopefully a little bit of money to pay an attorney, which can dramatically increase the outcome in their immigration case, because immigration is incredibly complex and you really need an attorney. And I say it all the time, and I feel like I can say it as someone who did anti-death penalty litigation in the South. Having an asylum seeker unrepresented in immigration court, which is this constantly shifting area of law that's so complex, a lot of judges don't understand it, defending themselves against all the resources of the federal government is like sending someone into a death penalty case in Alabama and not giving them any attorney at all. It's just not going to work, and that person is going to lose their case and they're going to be sentenced to death. And the circumstances that our clients face, the majority of them, are no less dramatic. And we've had people that have been returned home and really bad things have happened, and in some cases people have been killed. So one is focusing on your home community. The second thing you can do is, this is just a shameless plug for Otro Lado. We have 3 offices, one in Los Angeles, one in San Diego, one in Tijuana. The reason why we're able to do all of this work across borders with so many thousands of people per year is through volunteers. And it's not just volunteers who are lawyers, and it's not just volunteers who are Spanish speakers. We have a whole range of needs, and it's what is your willingness to serve based upon the skills that you have. Maybe the skills that you have don't make it such that you're going to be doing an intake, but maybe your skills are going to help us get all of this human rights reporting data into our database, and then we can look at trends and figure out how we're going to sue the US government again. And as an agency that has 9 lawsuits right now against the US government, we can never have enough people helping us to get that data in and analyze it and put cases together. And a lot of people think, well, I'm not by the border, how can I participate? We have figured out, like much of the rest of the world, for how people to participate remotely. And our current volunteer base and our current internship base or intern group is representative of all time zones in the US and 6 foreign countries. And so it's really, really opened up, and I really encourage you to reach out if the border specifically is calling you.
Yeah, as somebody who's a member of one of the remote Otro Lado teams, and my Spanish is not good enough to do translation, but we do getting people's packets in order. And there's 15 or so of us in different states, and we screw up the time zone for our meetings all the time, but we're chunking away at it. I've been amazed by to use a word that gets overused, the pivot that Otro Lado has done to make remote volunteering useful and possible. But I also want to say, Voces de la Frontera here, like when we first started hearing essential workers in the slaughterhouses in Green Bay saying something's going on here, we're not getting PPE, people are getting sick. The ability of Voces to mobilize, which depends on people being willing to publicize what's going on, to turn up virtually or otherwise, to participate. And Voces in Wisconsin is always looking for more people to be involved. So I think Nicole is right. There's local, there's national, there's transnational possibilities, and they're not as far away as you think. Please comment on.
Actually,
oh, sorry, Adam, go ahead.
One more plug, Rachel, for people to, a lot of folks that are coming would be released from detention, would be allowed to process their case if there was someone in the US that had US citizenship or was a green card holder or had a work card that would be willing to receive them. And there just isn't enough. And people are allowed to languish in detention in prisons, which have really horrible, inhumane conditions, simply because there's no one to receive them. And that could be a beautiful gift that an individual or a family could offer someone, is to just be that person's landing ground. And they don't have to stay forever. They can stay a couple of months, but just so that they can have that chance at freedom. That's just a wonderful way to support asylum seekers at this time.
Nicole, can you put something in the chat about how people might get in touch with you or Otro Lado, or, like just if there's like a website, maybe people who are wanting to. And Adam, I think you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say, these are all really crucial insights. And, I just also wanted to add that, as you've both mentioned, this fight did not start with the current administration. It's not going to end with the current administration. And I think it's really important that people get involved, regardless of what happens in the upcoming elections, because so many of the so many of the needs, will remain after. And there's certain inertia to the immigration bureaucracy and the policies on the books that regardless of who's in power, and I think it does matter, obviously, who wins these elections, but the needs will remain. And if anything, this current era has brought more people into the fight for immigrant rights. And I think that's actually a good thing. More people today are aware. It's helpful to sometimes have a common enemy. And I think that people who care about these issues are now mobilized and engaged. And hopefully that'll continue regardless of the outcome of the election, because the needs will remain. And as you've both mentioned, and as I certainly found in my research, a lot of these struggles, take sustained effort over many years, if not decades. Right? And the payoffs can be big and incredibly meaningful, but it happens through the sustained struggle, and the collaborations and solidarity that you've both highlighted.
Okay, I have a quick question for Adam. Is your data about the numbers of voluntary departures historically based on people who have agreed to voluntary departure, or is it people who have been confirmed to have actually departed? I don't know what data is available about possible discrepancies between these two things. Very wonky question from my colleague, Kristen.
Very nice to hear from Kristen. That's a great question. It's a difficult one to answer, in part because immigration data is always challenging and problematic. And I spent most of the decade working on this book trying to figure out the stats and trace the data. The categories are changing over time sometimes. The voluntary departures refer to the instances where someone has been granted, the government would say, but ordered to leave the country via voluntary departure. In most cases, those are confirmed, but not in all. In some places in the archives, I found that they did confirm those departures. In other cases, they did not. Part of the deal with voluntary departure, as I mentioned, was a cost-cutting measure. Right? And this was a way to speed up the deportation machine, right, through these expedited expulsions. And part of that was to cut down on the number of hearings and days in detention to save money, but also to cut down on the number of records that the Immigration Service had to warehouse, which made it challenging for me to then in turn figure out exactly what happened in a lot of those cases. But through a lot of kind of on the ground work at archives in different places, and especially through the USCIS History Office and Library, which is a wonderful resource. A lot of their sources are available digitally. If you look up the USCIS History Office and Library online, you can access a wealth of immigration service records from throughout the 20th century.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, I'm going to read a long comment by Alfonso Zepeda Capistran, and then there's a good concluding question. Some years ago, a friend of mine in Madison received a notice to turn himself into immigration. He decided to leave voluntarily, purchased his own airline ticket, and asked me to take him to the immigration office in Chicago. At his request, I was there to accompany him and to assist with interpretation. At one point, I left the room to grab something for him. A couple of minutes later, I returned and had been locked out